Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for the Glenbow's In Conversation series and tonight's discussion celebrating Maud Lewis and Canadian folk art. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the Glenbow is located in Mukinsters, Treaty 7 territory, and we respect the history, languages, traditions, and cultures of the nations on whose traditional land we reside. The Blackfoot Confederacy, which includes Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai, the Irahe Nakota of the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley nations, the Dene of the Tsuut'ina Nation, as well as the Métis Nation Region 3. Their contributions to the museum and continued support are integral to our success in educating our visitors and sharing the rich heritage of the land. We further acknowledge the vital connections we have to other Indigenous people, including other First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, whose visual and intangible culture is represented in our collections and exhibitions. My name is Hema Sivanasan. I'm the Chief Curator at the Glenbow. Given the current COVID context, I'm greeting you from the traditional territories of the Lekwungen people of the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations, otherwise known as Victoria, BC. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's discussion on the Canadian artist Maud Lewis and the importance of self-taught and so-called outsider artists. Our panelists this evening bring passion and will no doubt share some wonderful insights into Lewis's work. John Risley is joining us from Nova Scotia. John is the chairman and CEO of CFFI Ventures and has an extensive collection of over 200 paintings by Lewis, several of which are included in the exhibition that's currently hanging at the Glenbow, awaiting the day anytime soon that the museum can reopen to the public. Valérie Rousseau is originally from Quebec, but is joining us from New York, where she is senior curator at the American Folk Art Museum and co-curator of the exhibition Photo Brut, collection Bruno Deschamps and Company, which was recently named as a critic's pick by the New York Times. Moderating the panel this evening is Nicholas Bell, President and CEO of Glenbow. Before I hand over to Nicholas, please note the Q&A feature on the Zoom platform, and I encourage you to type in your questions for the panelists. So over to you, Nicholas.
Thank you, Hema, and it's wonderful to bring us all together today, continuing in these strange times, but a time in which we see a light at the end of the tunnel. I'd like to ask Valérie and John to join me now. Hi, Valérie.
Hi.
Hello, John.
Good evening.
It's so wonderful to see both of you coming to us from the East Coast. We were just talking before we came on about what it looks like in Alberta right now. And the good news is we are coming out of the third wave of COVID. We are getting clear signals from our government that things will be reopening soon. And we anticipate that Glenbow, along with all of our significant cultural areas, should be open within the next few weeks. This is phenomenal timing for us, in part because we have just hung the Maud Lewis exhibition on the walls, and it is glorious. And I cannot think of a more appropriate artist or a more appropriate collection of works to reintroduce Calgary and Canadians to their civic spaces. When all of us have been cooped up in our homes, as we are today, and looking forward to the moment when we can go back out and see each other in spaces that bring us joy, I think Maud Lewis's works can provide the opportunity for exaltation. And so we are thrilled to be hosting this exhibition at Glenbow, courtesy of the McMichael Canadian Art Collection in Kleinburg, Ontario. John, I wanted to begin with you this evening because you are perhaps the leading collector of Maud Lewis's work. And you obviously have a very personal connection to her work as well, given that you were born and raised and continue to live in Nova Scotia. I wanted to begin by asking you a little bit about what your first personal experiences were with Maud Lewis's work. How did you come to learn about her?
Jeepers. At my age, you forget more than you remember, but my father bought a painting from her for 50 cents back in the 1950s, and I think that was really the only piece of real art that, that we had in the house when I was young for a very long time. And I'm not suggesting that it left any sort of a deep impression on me, but I remember the image well, and just how uncomplicated it was, and simple and naive in a nice sort of way. And then I sort of began having an interest in art, I suppose, sometime in the 1980s, and thought about what it is that I should be collecting. And it seemed obvious to me that Canada, and more importantly Nova Scotia, is where I should start, sort of thing. And Maud, of course, is an iconic a persona, if you like, on the Nova Scotia scene. So it seemed like a good place to start. And then I was very lucky because I hooked up with a chap by the name of Alan Deacon, who's probably the sort of foremost expert on Maud's work, and he was very helpful to me in terms of putting together my collection over the years.
So for those who are listening right now and may not be familiar with Maud Lewis, she was born in 1903, I believe, in Yarmouth, Nova Scotia. She had a somewhat difficult life in the sense that she had health issues. She lived in relative poverty with her husband, Everett Lewis, from their marriage in 1938 until her death in 1970. They lived in a very small house just outside of Marshalltown, Nova Scotia, where she painted for decades. It sounds like she began by drawing or painting Christmas cards, I believe. Isn't that correct, John?
That's correct. Yes, and yes, using a very fine quill pen, and it's amazing to think that these Christmas cards she would sell for 10 cents, and then people would put a postage stamp on them and send them off, and they would go through the mail.
Well, maybe that's a prompt for our listeners to perhaps check their drawers and see whether or not they have any hidden Maud Lewis gems at home. Why don't we pull up a few paintings on the screen? I'd like to look at these with you, John and Valérie, because what we've done is we've just brought up a handful of the works, John, that you have lent to the exhibition that's now at Glenbow. And it's an opportunity to get a good feel for her work. Those of you who may have seen Maud Lewis's work before know that she involved a lot of repetition in her paintings. These are generally relatively small works, approximately 8 by 10 inches. And she was painting on beaver board. So they're quite durable, but as we go into these, if we go to the next slide, I think you start to get a sense of her style. John, this is one of your pieces. What can you tell us about this?
Yeah, so a common theme throughout is not just the image you're looking at. It's this idea of simplicity and happiness and color and life. And I think I said to you, Nicholas, when you and I chatted the other day, that if you have a Maud Lewis painting in a room, it helps bring the room to life. You walk into the room and your eyes are drawn to it, and it's always a bright, happy feeling. And I think that is very much in contrast to, as you say, the life she led, which was a very, very difficult life. Her relationship with her husband was difficult. She was crippled, as you know. Even her access to painting supplies was very constrained, and living in a one-room house. And I think that all those difficulties, if you like, gave her the resilience to lose herself, if you like, in her painting, and paint a happier life than the one she led.
Thank you, John. Let's see what the next painting is. And there's actually her husband,
Yep.
Everett.
Yep.
Some of our listeners or viewers may be familiar with the 2016 film Maudie, which was a biographical film about Maud Lewis's life and her marriage to Everett. And I mean, does this give us an accurate sense of the area in which they lived on the North Shore there?
Yeah, absolutely. So Marshalltown is sort of very close to Digby, and that area is both a fishing and a farming community. And all her scenes were sort of in some way involved the countryside and or the coast. And you'll see that theme, if you like, or one of those two themes resident in virtually all her work.
Excellent. And then I think the next slide might be the sign that she used. Here we are. John, this is magnificent. And those of you who may be familiar with her work probably recognize this sign and at least its expression. What can you tell us about this sign, John?
Yeah, so you just can't imagine that some of her work survived. As we talked about her Christmas cards and the fact that they actually went through the mail, and this was a sign that was hung outside for a number of years. And you can see on the four corners evidence of the backing separating from I mean, this was out in the weather, right? In the wintertime and so on. And it's obviously crude, but on the other hand, it's very endearing, as well as, and maybe because it's so crude. But how could you pass that sign by on the highway and not be drawn to sort of slow down and look at the color, the life, the imagination, if you like, and just things like the obvious things like look at how she's used different styles in the letters, right? The two N's are at odds to the styles of the other letters, and the O and the 4 and so on. Just, I think, no pretense here whatsoever, right? I am what I am, and you get what I am.
Well, so let's talk about that for a moment. If you were your father, let's say, driving down the highway past Marshalltown in the 1950s, and you saw this sign, and
Yep.
you stopped at this little one-room house, what would you expect to find?
Well, she would have had a collection of paintings inside. She always had an inventory. And over the years, her price went up from 50 cents to $2. And I'm not sure whether that was a function of inflation or demand. But very often people would say, well, could you do this or could you do that? And she was quite fussy. She would sometimes accede to those sorts of requests and sometimes not. She had a request from an American family who lived in a house very close to the water, and she was asked by that family to paint all the outside shutters on the house, which she did in the same sort of style you see here. And those shutters were, of course, outside and exposed to the weather. And it was only, oh, jeepers, I'm trying to think, maybe 20 years ago or so that we were able to recover all those shutters, and we were able to save some of them, and perhaps not all of them, and some of them are at the gallery in Nova Scotia. But for the most
still on the house 20 years ago?
They had been taken down from the house, but the water had got into the wood and separated the wood, and you can imagine just the deterioration, if you like, that the weather had taken its toll on these, and we did our best to try to restore them. But that was very exceptional, as was her painting of about 7 or 8 larger paintings. As you said, Nicholas, in your introduction, virtually all her work was sort of in that 8 to 10 to 12 inch sort of size range. And
here's one of the larger ones.
Here, yeah, no, this is the a 10 by or 10 or 11 by 12 or something. But we did see one of the earlier ones you had up was one of the larger ones, and she didn't like that. She decided that they weren't an accurate reflection of what she was good at, and she decided not to do any more, and went back to this size.
Now, Valérie, I want to ask you a question, because I know that you've spent time studying Maud Lewis's work. What do we know about her transition from something as small and, you might say, ephemeral as a Christmas card into an actual board that's being painted with paints that is obviously meant to be more permanent? What do we know about her transition from somebody doing something that might be more hobby-like into somebody who's really establishing a business, actually?
In the case of mode, I can talk more generally about how the processes of folk artists can evolve over time. My first interest for the works of Maud Lewis started by something that could not be sold and could not be exhibited in a museum. That was her house. The house was the main subject of a case study in my master's degree. I was trying to looking at how we can talk about recognition of an art field if we don't have ways of conserving the works of these individuals who are mainly investing their houses, their land, the surrounding land of their houses. And I was like looking at different cases in the world. And I think I looked at about 200 different cases. And Maud Lewis was very atypical because in her case, my understanding, John, and maybe I'm wrong, but she started to paint her house first. That was her first canvas. She started to invest the walls, the furniture, the staircase, indoors and outdoors, and then later on, the paintings came to life as a way of promoting or extending the relationship to a larger audiences. But John, can you just confirm that it's accurate that
Yeah,
she started
that is accurate. That is accurate. I think probably she continued to embellish the house, if you like. But you're absolutely right.
So I was fascinated by these artists who often started by their house. You know, the house as a very important symbolic presence. Your house is your identity. She decided to do something with this identity to maybe, like I would say, create something else than the norms or surroundings were dictating to her. She wanted to create something personal, something individual, and accepted that as well. So it's a convincing, persuasive mode of entering in connection with the outside and framing yourself in a very different way from your surroundings. And I was really fascinated by this stand of this woman who was somehow reserved, or because of her physical health, might not have been able to expand as much as we would or she would have wanted. And I think that her paintings were a way of traveling our identity outside of this more confining place of Marshalltown. So that's kind of a wise way to promoting yourself outside.
Well, so Valérie, I'm really glad you just mentioned that, because I just recently watched the movie Maudie, which is, by the way, for our listeners, is available for free on the CBC online platform, so you can watch it this evening. And I was, of course, the movie really focuses heavily on the relationship between these two people, and I am really conflicted in how to understand this relationship. And of course, relationships are complex, but it's a very antagonistic relationship in some ways, and yet there's clearly some spousal support for this idea that she was an artist. She painted their house. He helped her with her supplies, and he helped her to sell her paintings. And I was intrigued by this in part as we were thinking about the house, because I mean, just speaking personally, if my spouse woke up one morning and started painting flowers and birds on the wall, I'd probably have mixed feelings about that. And so I think it's really interesting that there was the support to transition that environment into something truly unique.
Well, this is not a unique case. All the cases I've studied and looked, around the world, where you have a situation where a passion like the one that Maud has for painting, for reframing your identity, if you want, is taking over. The family members do not agree or resisting. You have the spouse seen like their space being invaded, being confronted, and they often do not agree with the result. And also the fact that Maud was a woman at this period of time, and she became more popular and more, she became like somehow the one who was running the family, was able to make her living, being independent. So that might have created also a certain discomfort because she was independent financially, or she became independent more financially. And I think, John, you can certainly talk about it, about the dynamic that she might have had with her husband, but also it has to do with the fact that she became a star locally and nationally, certainly.
So let's talk a little bit for a moment about her becoming a star. Those of you who have spent a little bit more time with Maud Lewis know that she really came to national attention in about the mid-1960s. I know there was some CBC documentary footage of her working at home that was broadcast that brought her to attention beyond people who might have seen her in person. And I mean, how did she transition from somebody who was just trying to potentially to find her voice and to break out of this very quiet corner of the country into somebody who was recognized? John, what was, when you started to look at Maud Lewis for yourself, I mean, obviously you were aware of her somewhat through that painting that your father had purchased, but at some point you came back to her yourself. What was your awareness of her at that time?
Yeah, I'm not sure when we say star. I think star is a very relative term, and certainly in the early 1980s, really up until the beginning of the mid 1990s, you could still buy her paintings for $500 or less, right?
My timing is always awful.
Yeah, and even less 10 years before that, right? So my point is that I think, as you say, star, as I'm suggesting, star is a relative thing. I mean, look at the history of female artists in Canada, and not just folk artists. Look at the history of Emily Carr, right? And it's tragic that this woman depended on the support of the country's male artists of her time, when she was every bit as accomplished as they were. And it was decades after her death before her work was really recognized. So I'm not sure that it's that Maud is an anomaly in that respect. I think this was just the tragedy of the time for female artists. One thing that Valérie did say that I think is worth bringing to light is that the relationship between she and Everett was always, I think, a bit strained from what we understand. But I think that she held her own because she produced income. And it was income on which the couple depended. And the more income she produced, the more her importance in the relationship was elevated. And this was, of course, we're talking about very, very modest levels of income. But as you can see from the house you just saw, I mean, this was a 15 by 15 foot house, right? It's a you know, so their income needs or financial needs were obviously very modest, and the fact that she could, you know, sort of produce perhaps a couple of paintings a day and bring in $5 or $6 was a big deal.
So do we know what her output was? Do we have some sense of how many paintings she might paint per week or month or year or ever?
That's a great question. I'm not sure I'm capable of answering it. Valérie, I'll pass to you. Do you know?
No, I do not know.
And I have to say, guys, normally I would not ask a question like that, which in some art circles would be perceived of as crass, you know, like we're turning it into a commodity. But in reading the catalog for the exhibition that was produced by Sarah Milroy, the chief curator of the Michael, I think she makes a great point, which is that Maud Lewis's work and the way in which she created it and the way in which she supported them and put herself out into the world was genuinely commercially focused, but that did not subtract in any way from the way that we consider the work. I know we love to consider some sort of church and state separation between artists and market, but often that's not very realistic. And I think it's really heartening to see an example of a talented artist finding that financial support, however modest, through that production, and unapologetically supporting that family through sales. And so it's interesting maybe to consider, what does that look like on a daily basis? Is she painting all day? Is she painting here and there? I'm really intrigued by this vision of people driving up to the house, of course, unexpected and without appointments, to knock on the door and say, hey, I'll take that cat there.
Yeah. So I think the answer is yes, she painted profusely. And part of our inability to get our arms around the extent to which she was prolific and how many paintings do we think she did, roughly, sort of speaking, is the fact that the ownership of her paintings is very, very widely dispersed. I mean, I can tell you that I get inquiries from literally all over North America. Paintings have found their way into families, have been handed down. And in most cases, families will have one or two, maybe two paintings, right? And somebody who was given a painting dies, and then the children are sort of going through the contents of the house and what is this and what's it worth, and they go on eBay or something. But we see pieces of her work coming to us from literally all over the place. So, and I think that's not a function, that may be a function of sort of people who were tourists who arrived in the area and bought paintings and took them home. But I think it's more of a function of sort of multi-generational passing these paintings on, and as families disperse and they end up, with people moving and so on. So my guess is there's still hundreds and hundreds of families around North America who have one or two of her paintings hanging on their wall.
It's a good point, John, that you just talked about, the fact that she had a growing audience, multi-generational audience, and that I think that talks to the fact that her reputation was not only based on selling artworks, but also the fact that she was really part of the identity of Nova Scotia. She became a kind of a model, or someone people could identify with. And I think that played for the conservation of the house. I remember reading what has been favorable to the conservation, preservation, and the purchase of the house by the government at the time is that she was a star in a way that she received a lot of attention from tourists. People stopped by, people knew who she was. She sold her work. She was kind of independent somehow financially. She had this CBC publicity that in 1965 that brought her some kind of fame, if you want. But there's also, on top of that, the fact that she had the support also, in my view, and that it's meaningful, of citizens, local citizens, people who really wanted to save the house and keep this heritage, this legacy active. So when you want to preserve an environment like the one of Maud Lewis, if you don't have the support of the locals, if you don't have the support of the artistic community at large, you cannot justify the purchase and the conservation of a house like this one. So I think that she checked all the marks in terms of the national identity, in terms of how people identified to her, the fact that she had a local recognition or support from the community. All that really played in favor of a recognition, artistic recognition.
I think there's a really interesting point there, Valérie, about broad support. And as we're looking at these paintings, we know that they were broadly popular. We know that people found them to be accessible. People found them, I think, in John, your words, to be happy, to be joyful. And they function almost as small windows into an area, a place, a period of time. In some ways it may have been passing. Certainly there was quite a bit of change during her lifetime, and yet there is a bit of nostalgia perhaps, or a glance back into an earlier, simpler time that seems to be inviting to people. Certainly just as we saw that train, and as we're thinking about fishing boats, and as we're thinking about oxen, things that perhaps we wouldn't see in the same way today, or that we might not have even seen 30 years ago. And so I'm wondering if that plays into the appeal, which has only broadened in the last 50 years since her passing.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good point. It's sort of life as it was, not life as it is.
Valérie, I wanted to get back to the idea of the environment for a second, because for those people who may be less familiar with folk art, or with what we often call self-taught artists, Maud Lewis comes across as somebody who's perhaps unique. And certainly her art is unique. It's unmistakable for what it is. But was Maud, in the way in which she approached her environment, or her home, or her practice, was she unique in that way?
It's interesting because it's kind of at the core of the definition of what folk art, or what outsider art, or self-taught art is. This is the idea that you have a group of individuals that are developing an idiosyncratic expression, something that is personal to them, that is based in on their own experiences. So this is rooted in a biography, or in something that triggered their life and brought them to the creation of an alter ego, or creation of a project that is going to become a legacy, something of an alternative narrative, if you want, meaning that, you know, you have the high culture and you have everything else that is often not conserved in museums. You have these things that nobody think about conserving and saving and preserving. And I've been interested in everything that is not supposed to be looked at from the get-go in my art history classes. So this is something that is very at the core of the definition of folk art and self-taught art and outsider art. And I'm saying all these terms because this is so heterogeneous. You know, I'm looking at works that were produced by autodidacts in the 19th century up to today. And our museum in New York is very exemplary of this diversity of productions created by self-taught artists from the 18th century up to the present. You have such a diversity of mindsets. You have often the same obsession, the same need to create something apart, to distinct yourself from the others, to not follow the norms, to find in your own words something that makes you different than the others. Often this is not conserved. I would say probably 1% of what has been produced by individuals who are untrained artists is conserved. We talk about a very small percentage, and it's hopefully going to change over time. We see changes already, but she's not unique in a way that she is part of this big family of artists and creators, unstoppable and in need of creating something unique to them and say something in their own words.
Let's look at a few of those slides that give examples of artists who maybe work in a similar style or in a similar way to Maud Lewis, although of course their art is entirely different.
Yeah, here you have an example. John, I don't know if you heard of Arthur Villeneuve. Arthur Villeneuve is also an artist who, and you see on the slide here, who painted the walls, indoors and outdoors of his house first. It was his first canvas. It was a narrative that grew from one part of the house and when downstairs in the main room, I would say contaminated the atmosphere of the quiet atmosphere of the house and the family dynamic. Very dominant, smells painting and oil everywhere. And then when you start to receive like buses of tourists showing up during lunchtime and disturbing the family dynamic, and he realized that making canvases to continue to frame outside his identity became like, extremely popular and collected everywhere in the world, exactly like Maud Lewis. Very same structure, if you want, the system. And the work, actually, the house which is much larger. The house of Maud Lewis is roughly 4 meter by 4 meter deep and by 4.5 meters high. This one is more like a small Canadian style house, and it has been moved within a museum. And we talked about very unusual scenarios.
So John, do we know if Maud Lewis had any contact or recognition directly from other artists? Was she, other than the passersby or the tourists or the locals who were purchasing her work, do we know if she was in contact with people from this area?
Yeah, I don't know that she was, but on the other hand, there weren't a lot of artists for her to be in contact with, right? If you think, as you say, she died in 1970. A folk artist, we know it in Nova Scotia, really doesn't predate that period. The sort of next famous folk artist we would have in Nova Scotia is a retired fisherman by the name of Joe Norris. And he lived in a fishing community outside Halifax called Prospect. And his work was sort of thematically very similar to hers, in that he reimagined sort of all the scenes around which he lived, or the environment in which he lived. And very simple. He did all his own frames. He painted his frames. And I don't know this, but I don't doubt that perhaps she was an inspiration for him. He started off in the same way, sort of nobody taking him seriously, and painting on board before somebody told him, look, you should be painting on canvas, but canvas costs money, that sort of thing. So I think she has been responsible for, certainly on the Canadian scene, bringing much sort of deserved notoriety to folk art. I think most art connoisseurs would be dismissive of folk art as not really important. And look, I'm not arguing, obviously, that there are important artists and important art, and where she sits in that ladder is not really the subject of argument or dispute in my mind. My view is, look, what is art for? Art is to enjoy, right? Art is about imagination. Art is about removing you from reality and enjoying something continuously. I mean, I've got a lovely little Maud Lewis painting that's not subject to this collection in my gym. I've got a gym that I go off to all the time. And every time I walk in the door of that gym, I stop and I look at that painting, right? And I love that little painting. And I love the feeling that went into it. And I'm not saying I don't love others of my paintings. Of course I do. I love all the work I've collected, but I don't. I really sort of react aggressively to this idea. Well, okay, this is folk art, so it's not important. Well, why is it not important? What's the purpose of art? I'm not saying her paintings are ever going to be worth, huge amounts of money. No, I don't believe that for a second. That's not my point. My point is that, and as we were talking just before we started this little conversation we're having, McMichael Gallery, where this collection has come from, brought in a whole bunch of people who'd never been to McMichael before. Isn't that fantastic? I mean, that's a really good thing. And maybe people will come back and enjoy the Group of Seven and Emily Carr and the Riopelle and other important Canadian artists as a consequence of coming to the McMichael to see Maud, or coming to your museum, Nicholas, to see Maud, and getting interested in art. Surely that's a good thing.
I think you have a sympathetic audience here. Sorry, Valérie, go ahead.
No, I think it's so true. The fact that, one of the reasons why I think we need to embrace and be more democratic and accessible in our museums and open to present works by folk artists and self-taught and outsiders, it's also because it's really shake up the definition of art itself, and open up the borders and create connections that otherwise would not happen. I think that Maud Lewis has triggered reflections and thoughts that many other artists would not have done. But one point that I wanted to make is the fact that for the last 10, 15 years, I've seen an explosion of interest for folk art and self-taught art, and within the art world. I mean, there's no, I mean, the New York Times and art, artists, many people from the art world, but also students and new PhDs are done every year on folk artists. It was not the case like 25 years ago. I mean, it's exponential. The Venice Biennial that Massimiliano Gianni curated in 2013 included a huge amount of self-taught artists. So I think that we are really in a different era, and there's much more openness and interest by, I would say, that by peer artists, people who are professional artists looking at these works as teaching tools as well, and ways to explore and connect with their own art practice.
I wholeheartedly agree with both of you. I think art is primarily, it's a communication tool. It's a way to help people understand other people. I think folk art actually has quite an edge because it comes from outside of the academy. Well, guess what? So do most museum audiences. And if those artists and those artworks are able to communicate more effectively with those audiences, then so be it. I have no problem considering Maud Lewis to be a gateway drug for the museum. And if she can get people in the door and smiling and happy and talking and discussing and asking questions about another human being's experience in the world, we can only benefit.
Yeah, they are life lessons.
Absolutely. Perhaps this is a good moment for us to transition to answering some questions from the audience. And so, Hema, if you would like to join us, I'll ask you to start giving us some direction. Oops, you're on mute.
Okay, there I am. Well, thank you so much for such a lively discussion. That's so fantastic. So we have a few questions. The first question being, did Maud start painting after she married Everett?
Yes, we believe that to be the case, yes.
But isn't it also true that she learned, I don't know whether to paint or draw, but she was making cards prior to that, is that correct?
Yes, that's right, yes, yeah.
Nicholas, do you know if
but
there are any...
more as a hobby, I think, than as a business.
I believe that I read, but only briefly, that perhaps her mother taught her to make the cards, but I don't know much about it.
I'm wondering if Nicholas or John could tell us if there are any cards in the exhibition.
Yes, there are, and they're well worth paying attention to because they're sort of almost a different genre. And I say that because she used a fine quill pen, and they're in watercolor, and they're very fine, right? If you look at her paintings, that there's not that degree of finesse, if you like, or detail in her paintings that you find in her cards, and their cards are well worth paying attention to. Some of them are just intriguing. And thank heavens, people who got the cards had the sense to sort of look at them and say, wow, this is special, and keep them, rather than sort of doing what most people do with Christmas cards, which is to read who they're from and then throw them away.
At what point did she start selling her art?
My guess is her art was always for sale. But at what point in time was there sort of a demand for her art? I think that was probably certainly her early art was in the mid-50s.
John, am I correct that there's a handful of paintings from the 1940s?
Yes, very, very, very rare, very hard to find. We're sort of on the lookout for them all the time.
What difference would you describe between the paintings in the 1940s, which must be her earlier surviving true paintings, and maybe the 1960s?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think her many would say some of her best work was her early work. I would disagree with that. I think she was still learning, and I think she learned, and her sort of, let's call it mid-50s to mid-60s paintings were her best, because after that, I think she turned into sort of more of a, it became more of a business, and there were less, the themes were more consistent, and you would see many paintings that you'd have to look at hard to determine the difference, if you like, in how she interpreted a theme, oxen, for instance, and so on. So I like her sort of mid-50s to mid-60s work. I find her, to your point, Nicholas, I think her early work was still, she was still learning, and you could see evidence of that sort of uncertainty, if you like, maybe lack of confidence in how she painted.
There's a question here perhaps for Valérie. Is there a particularly Canadian quality to folk art?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. It's one of the first things that I asked myself when I saw the works of Grandma Moses. I was like, hey, are these works like sold or exhibited elsewhere in the world? And I think it's a question to John as well. It's like there are some aspects of folk art that makes often a certain type of public audiences to buy or to exhibit these works in which people can recognize themselves more. There are works that are more universal among this group of artists, and there are works that I would say that are attached to a certain type of landscapes that people would like to see themselves in. And I would say, like in the case of Maud Lewis, it's a work that has just started to, I would say, like circulate in the US. And I think there's a notion of folk art that is really rooted in a personal experiences. So if this is something too far away from what you have experienced or you have seen in your childhood, or references in terms of topics or themes that she has talked about, that might also prevent some public to connect with. But there are aspects of Maud Lewis works that I feel like are more talking to universal values, and I believe this is something that John can certainly talk about the fact that some of the works have traveled outside of the country, and but would it be a work that can resonate in South America, or can it be a work that can be collected by European collectors? This is a question that is still open.
Yeah, it's a great question, or a great point you make, Valérie. And we had an office in Bogota, Colombia, in the Bahamas, and I took Maud Lewis paintings to those offices. We had other paintings there as well, but nobody ever said, "Wow, why is that painting on the wall?" Everybody enjoyed the same sort of things that we enjoy here. So I don't think folk art is specifically a Canadian theme, if you like, that's unique in the art world. Obviously, Grandma Moses is very well known on the American art scene, and 20 years ago, when Maud was still sort of becoming to become sort of a collectible item, I think, and that was, let's call it at prices of $1,000 to $1,500. Grandma Moses paintings would be selling at Christie's for $25,000. Right?
When the market will change gradually, you will see an expansion of the realm of collectors outside of the country as well. I think it's often driven by the market.
Do you think, this is perhaps a related question, do you think she would have been successful or as successful if she was from another part of Canada or another country?
Oh, that's a hypothetical question that's difficult to answer. I think the countryside anywhere would have been her inspiration. And as much, I think her inspiration was the harshness of her life. I think that's what really drove her to paint. That would be my view. And she, not unlike most artists, had a physical affliction that definitely impaired her ability to paint at all, right? And she had to work with that and overcome that.
What factors determine if a piece of folk art has cultural or financial value?
It's interesting because the concept and the notion of folk art itself has been shaped by collectors. So it's more about who is recognizing the works and with other works they are paired with. It's how the value of an artwork is growing and how the reputation of an artist is expanding. And especially the notion of folk art is very driven by how collectors have included, paired, and grow their collection nationally, internationally. And they are, I mean, the example of Jean Dubuffet in Europe, and how this collection never grew so much with the inclusion of American self-taught artists because they were not his territory of explorations. He was more interested in traveling and in meeting like doctors in psychiatric hospitals, during a short period of a 10-year period. So this is how the concept has grew with the acquisitions and bounced back on how the profiles or with the biographies and the cases he has collected.
Would someone like to comment on whether the movie about Maud's life is an accurate depiction?
Oh, that's a tough one. I'm sort of a strange cat in that I purposely did not go to see the movie. And I did not go to see the movie because I did not want to have my image of her compromised by somebody else's image of her. And I was worried that look, the problem obviously, and you get the fact that every movie producer and director feels like they've got, and I'm not denying they shouldn't have the license to tell the story in their own way. So from what I know, I suspect that it's probably largely correct, but I'm sure there's lots of exceptions to that. But I can't comment more specifically.
But it's also probably contributed to her popularity, right?
I'm sure that's true. Sure. Yes. Yeah.
I think John's response is really wise, and we know that every biopic takes its liberties. I was actually reflecting just recently, I'd watched the 1965 CBC footage that interviewed Maud and Everett directly, and also interviewed a couple of friends of theirs, which it sounds like were the Fergusons, who were framing and selling their paintings as well for, I think, $10, which is 100% upcharge, by the way. And Bill Ferguson said something that I thought was quite memorable. He said, Maud and Everett Lewis are unique characters. And although Nova Scotia is full of characters, these are quite unique among characters. And I think, those are words that are from people who knew them well, as opposed to from film directors. And so it's one of maybe the only recorded observations of the couple and their art from people who were directly familiar with it, who weren't just passing by, which I found valuable.
Mm.
And Nicholas, it's something that we talked quickly about, the fact that the biography, when we talk about folk artists or self-taught outsider artists, it's often something that comes up front. We talk about what they have seen, what they have experienced, and we tend to not dig into the aesthetic of the works, their artistic project, and the creative processes, the materiality of the works. But I think it's just a question of time. I think we are at the beginning of an interest for a field. I think it's a pretty young field. And I don't see the biographies and the interest for biographies as a finality, but as an intellectual process to get a sense of who these individuals were and what kind of, they went through, what they went through informed the works they have done. I think it's necessary for us to understand from their really the particularity of their views on the world and what they have experienced to better understand what they have done. And then you have you have researchers and studies that are pushing further more and more, and I see them coming, and I see more students developing very original and relevant studies on specific artists, and how inventive their techniques were. And even though they were untrained, they really experimented with materials, and that was quite, these were quite like unusual ways of working with. So I think it's going to, eventually we are going to get there, but the biographies are upfront, sometimes too much in the picture to read the works.
John, I'd like to ask you a final question. You have, we know, a very large number of Maud Lewis paintings. They obviously bring you great pleasure and joy. Are you still looking?
Absolutely. So I don't want anybody in the audience to go out and start buying paintings, because you're going to drive the price up.
I think those prices are already up, so aren't they? You're too late.
No. We look for more unique pieces, not for facsimiles of what we've already got, sort of thing. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, I want to thank you both for joining us from New York and from Nova Scotia this evening as we celebrate the imminent opening of Paintings for Sale, the Maud Lewis exhibition, visiting Calgary from the McMichael Collection in Ontario. We are elated to be presenting this exhibition in Calgary. And as soon as we get confirmation that we are able to open, we hope that all of you will be joining us at the museum to exalt in these paintings' power and their joy together, because we think they can help turn this summer into a memorable summer for Calgary. John, thank you so much for making.
Not at all. May I just say in closing, I really hope that folks in the audience here get out to see the collection, and I hope they enjoy the paintings as much as I do.
Thank you. And thank you to all of our participants. Please stay tuned for notifications on the reopening of the museum, and we look forward to seeing you in person soon. Take care, everyone. Have a great evening.
Thank you.